Jack Beers, who's our Vice President and Editorial Director of Math and Science, and Rick Kaller, who's the Vice President and Editorial Director of Literacy and Humanities here at Triumph. Both men are former teachers, and they have both done a lot of programs for other publishers before they joined us. Rick has been with Pearson and with McGraw-Hill Education, and he's covered reading, language arts, social studies, music, and religious education. Jack has been with Macmillan, Curriculum Concepts, and Metropolitan Teaching and Learning. And he's also the author of a number of mathematics textbooks, including Voyages, Problem Solving Step by Step, and Metro Math Readers.
Hi everyone, this is Rick Kaller. I, as Adrian kindly introduced us, am the Editorial Director for Literacy and Humanities. And just so you think I'm not talking to myself, I do have my colleague next to me here.
Hi everyone, I'm Jack Beers.
Since we are in the same room today, we're going to be doing a little bit of a swivel with the monitor, so bear with us, and hopefully you won't get dizzy from all of this. We appreciate everyone taking time to join us today. We realize, just based on the poll results, obviously a majority of you are teachers. You no doubt had a long day, and you're probably getting ready for another long day tomorrow. So we appreciate that and recognize that you're taking time out of your day to spend with us. So Jack and I would like to share with you today, I think, some pretty common sense ideas that I think will probably resonate. These are probably ideas or issues that you're dealing with on a daily basis. So I think all of this will make sense. And we'd like to share our take and some of our thought processes on this as well too. First of all, we would like to put forth the idea that preparing for high-stakes tests does not have to eat up all of your instructional time. I'm sure a lot of you are smiling. We also realize that there's a caveat here. We recognize that a lot of schools and districts have mandates or requirements about how much time you spend doing this. So that is sometimes outside of your control. I think what Jack and I would like to suggest, though, is that if your curriculum is focusing on the key instructional shifts that exist for both math and ELA, you are already doing a great deal of preparation for your students for those high-stake tests. So our second big idea is just that the instructional shifts are really the foundation behind the new standards and in turn the new assessments. When we say new standards, we're really referring not to just Common Core, but all of the new state standards that are out there as well too, whether or not they are based or somewhat modified off of the Common Core. The bottom line is that it really pays to know those shifts and to embrace them and to build them into your instructional routine. Our last point is also pretty common sense. It pays to know your state test. And that includes knowing the organization, knowing the format, knowing the item types that are used, knowing the weight of the concepts and skills that are going to be on that test. Once you know that, you can help your students prepare accordingly as well too. Now, it probably is worth mentioning a few things that this webinar is not going to cover as well too. Jack and I are not going to get into a discussion about Common Core standards versus state standards. Frankly, we just don't have enough time, and for the people that are joining, I see some people in Athens, Greece right now. You probably would like to go to bed within the next few hours, so it's probably not fair to dip into that right now. We're also not going to talk about the appropriateness of the length of the tests, or even the amount of testing that students face within the length of a school year. We're not going to talk about how test results are used. And as challenging as those three bullets are, probably the least challenging would be to talk about how to achieve world peace. We're going to save that for another webinar as well too, once Adrian gives us permission to talk about that. So moving on, you probably see here on this slide, name your test. More than likely, I would say that you see a test that you either know about or that you are preparing for right now, in the process of preparing for. The two consortium are listed there, PARCC and Smarter Balanced. There's ACT Aspire, there's SAGE, there's America Institutes for Research, and of course there's a whole plethora of state tests that are out there right now as well too. It goes without saying that there are a lot of tests that are out there, and there are just as many ways to prepare for all of those tests as well, too. So, with that in mind, we would actually like to ask you just a couple of other poll questions. I'm going to zip over here. You know what? I'm going to read it first and then go to the poll tab. So this first question, what are the expectations of your school or district regarding the amount of time spent on high-stakes test preparation? Let's see if I can pull this up. The choices range from no expectations to no limitations on preparation whatsoever. There's another choice: you can prepare for a set period of time, perhaps a month or two prior to your test. Fourth option is you can prepare for a set percentage of time, say 5% of your class time up until the test. And then we know of a lot of schools that do test preparation in after-school or weekend sessions. So we're seeing a vast majority, about 57% right now, no limitations on preparation. No expectations is tied with teachers that can prepare for a set period of time, for example, 1 month. No limitations on preparation is growing, 63% now. That's very interesting. It really helps us to get a gauge on that as well, too. We hear anecdotal evidence from teachers in specific situations around the country. It's good to have a poll like this. 63% say no limitations on preparation. And we close the voting for now. Second question we'd like to ask you: to what extent does preparing for a high-stakes test or for a high-stakes test impact your instruction? We'd really like to know your opinion on this. And the choices that you have are no impact, a minor impact, and a major impact, to the extent where you're feeling that you're actually prevented from being able to cover certain skills, certain concepts. Not surprisingly, we're already at 55% of you are saying a major impact on your instruction. Almost a third of you are saying a minor impact, 7% no impact. Just give you a few more seconds. Okay. Looks almost 60% of you feel that there's a major impact on your instruction. That's obviously very significant. Thank you for sharing that information with us. I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Jack, who's going to talk to you a little bit about math.
Hi, everyone. It'll be fun to work on the math side a little bit here. And when we talk about the key instructional shifts in mathematics, focus, coherence, and rigor, we're really talking in terms of assessment preparation, more about rigor. Because focus and coherence really pertain more to organizing our curriculum and getting ready to teach. Rigor is really about where we need to go to organize students' thinking so it's ready for assessments. When we think about rigor, we have a lot of different ideas about what that means as well. Some of us think in terms of a rigorous item is where you're multiplying a 4-digit number times an 8-digit number. But in the mathematical community, the consensus is that rigor has more to do with the equal balance of focus between conceptual understanding, procedural skill and fluency, and applications. And this is something that's been at the heart of sort of the math wars for a number of years, about whether focus on concepts, procedures, or applications are more important. But it was really in 2008 when the National Math Panel came together and looked at this issue and made a very strong statement that they're all equally important. Not only are they equally important, but the capabilities support each other, that when you're working on problem solving, you're reinforcing skills. When you're working on concepts, that needs to be related to problems, and so forth. So we need to find ways of interrelating the instruction we're providing for each of these three major pillars of mathematics. The tests that are coming out these days, whether they're coming out from the national consortia or from state agencies, are reflecting these changes too. We're seeing, and you can expect to have your students see, a lot more different perceptual models. items that unfold in phases, and a lot more work on students' part on explaining or justifying their thinking. So when we think about where we need to go as teachers to prepare kids, we don't necessarily need to think about stopping our instruction a month before the major test to turn our attention 100% to the test prep. We can really begin on day one with building into our instruction, our practice, and assessment a focus on concept skills and problem solving, and building these connections into the different representations of a skill or concept in order to build higher rigor. Many of us are familiar with Jerome Bruner's model of how students learn in stages, basically beginning with concrete experiences, moving to iconic or pictorial experiences, and then moving to a symbolic level. Some of the work that Bruner did in his later stages with his colleagues, in particular with Richard Lesh, led to this more recent model that seems to be more at the heart of mathematical thinking these days. And it incorporates not only the concrete, pictorial, and symbolic levels, but also builds in the concept of the language development and real-life situations that are related to those concepts. And probably even more important, this model highlights the importance of making connections among all 5 of those facets of conceptual understanding. So just for example, if we're looking at a mathematical situation describing multiplication, we've got Mike making 3 trips of 5 miles each. And the way that's going to look in these other manifestations is we're going to have experiences where kids connect that to working with counters or linking cubes, where they represent it with the multiplication sign. They use the language, and they use various models in order to represent that, including number lines, arrays, and groups. And in the process, they're building connections constantly among all these different ways of representing multiplication. So the first tip for building rigor is to build connections among all the different representations of a concept or a skill. And I think what I'd like to do now is sort of jump under the hood and look at some real-life examples of items that you would see on a high-stakes test to see how those are constructed, how you can sort through the items that you have in your materials, and even how you can create materials that are high rigor items from what you have. So I want to begin by looking at a 4th grade fractions example. And with fractions, we're going to have several different models to look at. We've got a strip model, the usual long model. We've got circular models, area models, and rulers. But we also have the number line models that are built on the idea of a fraction as a number, because oftentimes students understand a fraction as a part-whole relationship without really understanding that it represents a number. In addition, we'll have the 4 other types of representations that I referred to earlier, the symbolic, the verbal, the real life, and actually the multiple of a unit fraction is a particular concept that we want to address. Okay, so the first example I want to look at here is one in which we're building a connection between a number line model and a symbolic representation. Except there's something a little different about this item. At first glance, it may look like a multiple choice item, but looking more carefully, you'll see that it's actually a matching item. However, unlike some of the matching items we've seen in the past, this is actually developing different concepts within the same problem. For example, we want students to be able to recognize a fraction on a number line as part of a whole, but we also want them to be able to recognize the fraction for a number that's more than 1. So looking at choice B here, where the whole goes, or actually the number line goes all the way to 2, one of the difficulties that students are going to encounter is if they see the 0 to 2 as the whole, they may quickly decide that this represents 3/4, that there are 4 segments, each of them is 1/4, so 3/4 is the amount that it's representing. So this gives us information about whether they can understand fractions that are less than 1, as well as ones that are greater than 1. Okay, here's another example. This time we've picked a a model that's a bar model of fractions, and we're showing the addition operation, but it's a different type of item as well, different type of answer mechanism. We've got true-false items here, but unlike the true-false items of the past, each of these is contributing to our understanding of what students are able to understand about how this model represents different aspects of fractions. So in part A, we're trying to see if they can relate the bar model to the symbolic representation of addition. Whereas in parts B and C, we're looking at how language is related to the bar model. So this is a modern item type that you would see on a lot of high-stakes assessments. Okay, here's a third example, and this time what we're doing is actually not a multiple choice item, but an item in which there can be more than one correct response. These have different names in different states, but the item deals with seeing if students can decompose a mixed number into its component parts, which could include a whole number plus a fractional part, or it could also include breaking down the fractional part into unit fractions. So you'll notice for part A that we've broken the mixed number down into whole number parts plus a fraction. And in part E, we've actually taken the whole number part and looked at whether students can recognize that as a 10/10 rather than as 1. If you look at the other choices too, there's a couple of others that are correct. Do you see them? Well, part B is one, and part D is another, and they each represent a different way of decomposing a number. Okay, here's again another different type of model and a different type of answer mechanism. In this case, we're having students justify their answer by looking at a number line model and seeing if it correctly represents addition. If students look carefully, they'll see that the first part shows 2/10, but the second part actually represents 5/10. However, as many of you know, a very common misconception for students is when they're counting on a number line to start counting with the initial position. So it helps you as a teacher to know if they have that particular misconception, and then you know how to work on improving it. Okay, this is a real doozy. This item here, first of all, is a different answer type. It's a sorting item where students are sorting these fractions into 3 categories. But look at what's going on here. There's actually 3 different models that we're relating to each other. We've got a contextual problem that is talking about the fraction of the sandwich that Hank ate. We're having students relate that to the strip model, which shows the fraction. So they've got to be able to see that he ate 1/3. And then we're using the symbolic representations of fractions to see if they can make the connection between all 3 levels. So this is a very high rigor item. And this is the type of item that you're definitely going to see on high stakes tests. It's the kind of thing you should be looking for in your materials and hopefully can even create. So let's now jump into a completely different concept. Let's look at multiplication and division and see what we can do in terms of relating the different representations here. We've got 3 different models we're going to look at: a number line model, the array model, and the group model for multiplication. And then we'll relate them to the other 4 aspects of multiplication. So I'm going to ask you to think just for a second about how you could connect the meaning of multiplication to a real-life context. How can you set up an item to do that? Okay, here's an example of how you might do that. What we've done here is to set up some true-false examples where we've written 4 contextual examples. The first one, A, model train has 8 cars, each is 6 inches long. How long is the train? That's a multiplication situation. But if you look carefully at the others, they represent other operations. So this is an opportunity for us to discriminate whether kids can recognize multiplication situations. Here's another one, but this one has to do with fractions. the standard here is whether students can recognize that when you multiply by a fraction less than 1, the number you're multiplying by gets smaller. But it's reported in a contextual situation. Because here we're talking about the amount of sleep that people get. Now, when Van reports that he sleeps 1 1/8 times as long as Drew, I think Van must be a mathematician or something, because I can't imagine a kid reporting that. But the question that's asked here, whether Angie slept longer or shorter than Drew, is a matter of recognizing that the fraction that Angie's multiplying by has to either be greater than 1 if she's sleeping longer, or less than 1 if it's less. So you can see from the third bullet that she's sleeping a shorter amount of time. The key thing here, though, is the connection between a conceptual situation and a meaning of multiplication. Okay, now I'm going to show you an especially unusual kind of connection. Usually when we talk about division, and we're talking about the verbal representation, we're talking about remainders, we're talking about quotients, dividends, and divisors. But we usually see those only related to the symbolic number. We see, 23 divided by 6 as 3R5. So it really looks surprising when you see an item set up like this, where we ask students to use a division model and compare what they're seeing in the models to the language that represents division. So here what we have is 220 represented in the model, separated into 2 sets. So we're going to get a quotient of 110. But this looks so different that it really tests whether students don't just recognize the way it looks on the piece of paper, but do they really understand what the concept is about? Okay, for you middle school and secondary folks, I don't need to explain how all these different representations define the meaning of proportions, but I think what we ought to do is look at some items that would help you see if kids recognize those. So here's an item where we're trying to see if these various choices are ones that kids recognize as a proportional relationship or not. So when we look at item A, y equals 3x plus 2, we hope that kids will recognize that because of the constant, it's not a proportional relationship. In B, because of the way this real life situation is stated, they should recognize it as proportional. In C, they have to look and see if these ordered pairs fall in equal ratios, which they do not. And in D, we've got another situation that is a proportional relationship. So we want them, in the process of just this one item, to be able to show us 4 things they understand about proportionality. And these are items that you can find in your resources, or you can build them yourself. Okay, let's think about another way we can put these different aspects of proportionality together. Let's suppose we want to look at the idea of a mapping representation of a function and look at how the domain and range are related to each other and see how that's related to a constant of proportionality. It's kind of like pick 2 different things from this list and see how we can make them fit together. So this is what that item might look like. In the first item, these are both multiple choice, but in the first item, what we're really looking at is a function in which the rule is to add 4, and in the second item, it's a function in which the rule is to multiply by -1. So we want students to recognize that the first is not proportional, the second is, and what that constant of proportionality is. So I guess if the first big tip is to build connections among representations, the second would be to have students build their own representations. But I want to back up just for a second, because initially we didn't talk about fluency. However, fluency is really an important thing to be building along with concepts, because fluency is not just about basic facts. Fluency is about combining your understanding of basic facts, what you know about algorithms, and what you know about special ways, to include your understanding of place value and operations in order to compute more fluently. So just for example, if I have a student who I've asked to take 1001 and subtract 202, I sure don't want to see that student crossing out a bunch of zeros. What I'm hoping is that they can use their sense of place value to take away 100 and then count back 2 more in order to get to 899. I think that's right. All right, but I want to move ahead into looking at what it looks like when students build their own representations. Okay, now here's a great example from elementary school where we're asking students to create a drawing that shows 5, 6. Now what we usually have seen is either a strip model here that has just 6 squares in it, where kids are expected to fill in 5, or maybe nothing at all. But the advantage of presenting a grid in this way is that if I've got a student who has the misconception that 5, 6 means there's 5 shaded and 6 that are not shaded, I'm going to see that when that student draws the representation in this grid. Also, who knows, I may have a student who fills in 12 squares here, or uses a model with 12 squares and fills in 10. So I'm learning something about what that student knows about equivalent fractions. So opening up the opportunity for students to build as much of the representation of the concept as they can really gives us a lot more information about what they know and prepares them better for high-stakes assessments. Okay, next, in addition to students creating their own representations, we want them to be explaining what they understand. So if I've got a problem like this where kids are comparing the cost of text messages in terms of the rates that they're paying, I want to know not only that they can compare them and see whether they're the same numerically, but what does it mean? It means that they're being charged the same rate or different rates. Somebody's getting a better deal or somebody's getting a worse deal. So we want them to make the connection in their explanations between the mathematics and what it means in real life. Okay, here's another situation where we're looking at ordered pairs, and we want kids to be able to sort out which two of the 3 ordered pairs could be part of a proportional relationship, and then to explain why. So they have to explain what it means about the line going through the origin and relate that to other understandings they have about proportionality. Okay, lastly, we want students to be able to look at and analyze and critique other students' reasoning. So this is an example where Juan has taken a series of operations and found a way to evaluate that to get a numerical value of 40 by putting in parentheses and other grouping symbols. Here we want students to really engage with that result and try out some different ways to figure out how Juan could have gotten that, and then to be able to explain how they got it. They may say that they tried something and the answer came out too big, so they had to figure out a way to get a smaller answer. Or we may have them look at explanations that students have provided for how they solved the problem. In one case it's right and the other is wrong, and for them to look into it and figure out where that mistake occurred. But the more we have students look into other students' reasoning and analyze it, the more we understand what they actually know. So in summary, I think that the main ways we can build rigor are to build all these different connections between different representations. And I just want to encourage you to think that these are things that are in the materials you have, or they're things that you can build yourself. So I'm going to pass this back to Rick. I'll be back a little later for questions, but right now we're going to talk about ELA.
Okay. Thank you, Jack. There we go. Moving the microphone a little bit. Okay. As you just heard from Jack, he focused primarily on rigor as one of the, out of the 3 key instructional shifts for math. I wanted to just kind of quickly recap the shifts for ELA, and I'm going to be focusing on mainly 2 of them, the first 2 in particular. I should say, obviously, different states have different interpretations of the shifts. Some states have 6, some states have 5. I think they can all really boil down to the 3 that you see here on the screen. The first of which is regular practice with complex texts and their academic language. Obviously something that's of the utmost importance right now in preparing and preparing for college and careers. It's interesting, one little tidbit research-wise is that we know that no matter what combination of factors is considered when defining text complexity, the ability to read complex texts is the single greatest predictor of success in college. And that finding is true regardless of gender, race, or socioeconomic background. Of course, connected with comprehension is the focus on academic vocabulary, which are, of course, words that appear in a variety of content areas. Second point, reading, writing, and speaking need to be grounded in evidence from texts. Citing text evidence, you hear it constantly, both in literary and informational genres. What this really translates to is that rather than questions that students can answer solely from their prior knowledge, students must be able to answer questions that depend on their having carefully read the featured text. And then, of course, building knowledge through content-rich nonfiction, which can typically come from science, can come from history and social studies, and even come from the arts. So the two national testing consortia, PARC and Smarter Balanced, are saying that shifts in the standards require advances in assessment quality. So what does this mean? How does this translate? First of all, texts must be worth reading. Texts have to be authentic. Texts have to represent a variety of genres, both literature and informational texts, and they have to have a sufficient level of complexity or rigor. The new assessments that are not so new, they're already here, frankly, are going to use authentic texts that they claim are worthy of study and that have to be motivating and engaging to read. Second of all, questions must draw students deeper into the text. This requires students to do and to hone their text-dependent analysis skills and their higher-order thinking skills. Again, the new assessments are going to use sequences of questions that progressively draw students deeper and deeper in, not just random series of questions. Jack presented a nice kind of collection of old test items versus new test items. These come from the PARC website. This is not promoting PARC per se, but it is a nice comparison of a little bit of old versus new. You can see right there this first vocabulary-based question, which two words are synonyms for heap. There's no context provided. There's no passage for the student to go back to. Versus the one in purple on the right. It's a two-part question. Students obviously have to read to gather meaning, and then they have to apply it. So for part A, students are having to read that passage. It's referred, a specific paragraphs is referred to. And then in part B, students have to find words in the passage that back up their choice for part A. Let's look at a writing prompt example from grade 7. Typical older test item type, where students are asked to write something based on personal opinion. There's nothing wrong with writing persuasive essays in the slightest. That's good. But students are basically using their opinions as evidence. The new writing prompts that students are going to be encountering on the new assessments are going to have multiple sources sometimes, at least one, sometimes multiple, that students are going to refer to, and that's going to incorporate a variety of reading and writing standards along the way, much higher level of rigor. So, I think we've been saying this, teaching students how to dig deeper into complex texts, how to grapple with vocabulary that they don't know, and how to think critically is all part of our ELA instructions. It's key. Simultaneously, it prepares students for the text that they are going to be encountering on their high-stakes assessments. So how do you go about doing this? You already are doing that. And there are many strategies, there are many methodologies for doing this. One that you no doubt have heard a lot about is close reading, and that's one that I'd like to focus on just a little bit right now. You know this definition, you can probably say it with me. Close reading is the process of reading a high-quality text multiple times for the purpose of gaining deeper comprehension. For those of you who practice close reading constantly, you know it's not something that you prepare or start just a few minutes before class. A lot of preparation is required for this. The teacher needs to examine the text well in order to plan and teach each reading. It's important that every single reading should have a very explicit purpose. Students need to interact with the text. That's very key. And even some items or some additional things that I would list on that. Students need to fully understand the lesson objective for the texts. Text-dependent questions need to be used to move students toward a deeper understanding of the text. And peer interaction is going to help engage students in deeper thinking. It's all part of the close reading. Now, there are many resources that are available to help you as an educator instruct and help students experience the close reading process. I've pulled some examples from a program that we published called Support Coach. There are many more out there. I pulled this because it was easy to access. So let me just walk you through this very carefully, or very quickly, I should say. Support Coach lessons actually for ELA, contain 3 selections each, and each selection is to be read multiple times, 3 times specifically, in a close reading process. We start the close reading process with preparing with a skill. You'll notice here that on the left-hand side of the page, there's a practice the skill with a first read level. That's where students are going to, in this case, read about and be introduced to and practice citing textual evidence for inferences. The students then do the first read of the selection that we'll see in just a few seconds. Following that first read, students then come back and practice another skill, which is on the right-hand side of this page, word choice and tone. The third read focus in this particular program is always on critical thinking. You'll notice at the bottom of the page in little bars or in little lozenges, each skills page always directs students to a passage-specific either graphic organizer or close reading worksheets, which helps students, again, interact and engage with the text. Here's a spread that shows a sample passage from this lesson, which happens to be on historical fiction. You'll probably notice a little atypical in the margins. You'll see color boxes that are close reading tasks. These tasks are color-coded, which are going to help students, as well as you, navigate this 3-read process that's going to happen with the passage. Up here in the top left, you'll see a little key that helps students remember what they're focusing on for each read. Again, a very purposeful read each time. The first read, they're going to focus on textual evidence that they can cite when they're making inferences. The second read's about focus on words the authors use to express tone. And again, the third read is on critical thinking. So as the student is going through this passage, if she's on the first read, she's going to focus primarily on the orange callouts along as she's proceeding through this passage. On the next page here, we have some examples. You'll notice that some text-specific questions and text-specific questions prompt interaction with the text, including markups that students are requested to do. You'll see with the annotations here, students are underlining and circling words and phrases that help support the skill that's being focused on. When there's a pencil icon in these sidebars, that means that students are to record their answers on a close reading worksheet, which they have in conjunction with the passage that they're reading. Answers to some callouts are recorded in graphic organizers, which are also unique to the passage. In this case, a textual evidence chart is filled out as students are doing this particular read. At the end of the first read, there is a vocabulary activity. This always happens after the first passage, which goes in depth. And then at the end of the third read, which is after the first 2 reads and the skills that go with them, a higher order thinking question concludes that third read. So all of this happens with one passage. And then the entire process repeats with the second passage and the third passage. It can be a time-consuming, very intense process, but it does help train students in the attention and the focus that they need as they dig deeper into the different layers of each text that's presented here. So in the time that we have left, I see it's 4:45. We have probably about another 5 minutes before we go to questions. Jack and I wanted to ask a couple more poll questions, and then we wanted to show you some examples of item types that are both digital and print-based. So the first poll question, very quickly, what % of the items your students will encounter on their high-stakes test will be tech-enhanced? By tech-enhanced, we're meaning not the traditional multiple choice and open-ended response, but multi-select, highlighting, matching, graphing, sorting, so forth and so on. So let me kick that poll open. Possible answers: more than 50%, less than 50%, and I just don't know. We're around 50% right now. Respondents saying that more than 50% of their items will be tech-enhanced. Wow. 25% say less than 50%, and a good chunk of you, about a third of you, are not sure, and that's fine too. In the states that Jack and I follow, there is still a lot of decision-making going on, and a lot of sample items are being tested, are being field tested. A lot of decision-making process still to have happen for sure.
And many states are in transition too.
Absolutely. Okay, 40% of you, the numbers look like 40% say more than 50%, about a fifth of you say less than 50%, and about a third of you say you're not sure. Appreciate your candor on that. Second question, how do you prepare students, your students, for these new digital formats? And your options to choose from are mainly online practice, mainly print-based practice, both online and print-based, or neither. Vast majority are saying both right now. We're around 60%. Somewhere around 15% each for mainly online and mainly print-based, up to about 70% with both. That's terrific. And we also understand too that there are, of course, logistical issues with doing purely online practice. That can be a challenge as well too. Looks like around 67% at the end of the day say both. Terrific, thank you. So what you see here, very quickly, is a representation, a graphical representation of some of the new item types, of the tech-enhanced item types that are out there. You saw some examples of this in the items that Jack was showing you. These can be found in both math and ELA, for that matter. A lot of them are built off of the traditional item types, and some really require a lot of graphical dragging on the screen when it comes to matching, or drag and drop, or even fill in the blank, sorting for that matter too. Some make use of computer functionality, like highlight, instead of having to manually circle or underline. These should be somewhat familiar. What we wanted to show you, and basically what we wanted to neither endorse or support, is the fact that both online practice and print-based practice are effective and can help. Again, logistical concerns and being what they are, you can't always get access to computers. Perhaps you can't always get access to print-based materials for that matter. It depends on the kind of classroom you're in. But preparation with the item types can happen in both formats. Here's an example right here of a drag and drop item. This one happens to focus on the importance of citing textual evidence. You'll see here a little chart on the left column. You'll see 3 inferences that come from a passage that the students have just read. Below that, you see 6 pieces of text evidence, from which the students will choose 3 to support the inferences on the left. I like this item in particular because of the number of pieces of text evidence that the students have to choose from. It's not just having 3 down there, they have 6. So it's a much more challenging question. And of course, drawing inferences is not the easiest skill to master. Here's an example of highlighting, also focusing on citing text evidence. I pulled this as a pretty obvious example, but this is a nice way to, for example, highlight a key detail from an informational text passage. Here's an example of fill in the blank or drag and drop. Drop down instead of drag and drop. In this particular example, there are excerpts from a passage that students read. The students then have to complete the next sentence by choosing the best definition of the underlined word in the text above, and then determine whether the connotation of that word is positive, negative, or neutral. So there are 2 possible drop-down options for each sentence then. Here are some print-based examples of the very same types of items. And these are probably, obviously, the item types are familiar. The way in which different publishers or different teachers choose to modify tech-enhanced items for a print format can vary a lot. Here are some examples from a product that we published called Performance Coach, but there are many ways to do this. Drag and drop can be done just as simply as this, listing statements from a passage that students have just read, and then they have to either write or they can actually draw, circle, and connect down to whether or not each statement is a claim, a reason, or evidence of the argument. Here's a highlight or underline, I guess underline in this case since it's print-based. I'll go also focusing on citing text evidence. It's a two-part question. The first part, they have to circle a statement that is supported by evidence in the excerpt of a drama that they just read. And then for part B, they have to find two details from that drama that support their answer to part A. Finally, matching. Perhaps it's more fun to actually drag and connect things on a computer screen, but it works just as well on paper. Here, students are asked to read a sentence on the left and then match the underlined word to the definition on the right. So I think in conclusion here, knowing that we are running a little tight on time, again, Jack provided strategies for how to build rigor in math. I talked through a close reading approach that helps students prepare for ever increasingly complex texts, how to build the vocabulary. These are things that are part of your instruction already. Doing this on an ongoing basis is probably the best way, honestly, to help your students prepare for their high stakes assessments. And the only other parting shot that I think we'd like to share with you is so many of the state tests or the national consortia tests have online samples, samples of the tests, samples of the items. It really pays to take time to go in and take those items and those sample tests yourself. If you're like me, you won't get everything perfect. I won't tell you what my score was, but it's time well spent. And it helps build a little credibility with your students as well, too, when you know you've been through, when they know that you've been through what they're going to go through as well, too. So with that, I believe we are to the question and answer time. We will wait to hear questions from Adrian, who is still our host. Again, we thank you for staying with us. We know it's late in the day for a lot of you, or maybe a little earlier for some of you. There we go. Okay, we're seeing some now. What are some strategies to teach close reading to students with very low reading comprehension levels? That's a great question, and it begs the topic of the value of leveled readers and leveled reading in general. There are many thoughts and opinions on that. I still think the process of close reading can be done with students that are struggling to read on level. Support Coach, the program that I mentioned before, is actually, while the program contains on-level texts, a lot of the close reading, the multiple reads that happen, are done not just independently by students. Oftentimes, the first selection in each lesson is done as a whole group, with the teacher leading that whole read. And then gradually, kind of a gradual release of responsibility, subsequent passages in that lesson are then released. Perhaps the second passage is then done as a small group, and then with the last passage being an independent chance. So there is kind of a scaffolded approach. There's definitely a gradual way to move from whole class to independent work. And that's a strategy that we found has worked well with students that are struggling to read on level. Let's see here. Here's one question. For close reading, are they reading the entire text multiple times, or are they going back into certain sections of the text to answer different questions? Deborah, that's a good question as well, too. With the length of passages that are in the product that I showed you, they are reading the entire text multiple times, and 3 times specifically. I think that partly depends on the length of the text that you're working with right now. Whatever resource you have, or if you're selecting texts yourself, you can help vary the length of that text. There is something to be said for building stamina. And I think while it can be difficult to read multiple times and to keep students focused, if you set the expectations and you set the purpose up front, and if you start as a whole group and move through that and then gradually release and allow students to do more and more on their own, I think that's a process that will work. Here's a math question. So would you focus on doing less problems with more steps in math rather than many single-step problems?
I think yes, I would focus on doing fewer problems with more steps. In terms of also, I include problems that have different dimensions to them, so that kids have a chance to not only do multi-step problems, but do problems that involve several standards. A lot of the items that you're going to see on these high-stakes assessments will come from one domain, but they will include questions that really address different standards. So, for example, you may have an item that deals with a geometry domain, but has, let's say, to start out with a question that deals with properties of a triangle, and then moves to looking at the perimeter of the triangle and maybe the area of the triangle. So I think many times if you can provide kids with an opportunity to look at one object for that assessment that has a lot of different things going on with it, it's a more robust item.
Thanks, Jack. Another question from Jan. Do the new tests still have listening skills? That is a good question, Jan. We have found, I'm trying to think, I don't know, and someone could very well correct me if I'm wrong here. At this point in time, there are not, the listening strand is not being tested. There certainly are plans to do that. I think a lot of it had to do with the technology. The consortia were not focusing on listening and speaking skills at first. And I'm trying to think of state tests that I know of, and I don't believe I can recall any that have a listening section per se. I do think that's changing, and that was a limitation. I think obviously the focus needed to be on reading and writing and foundational skills first, and it's a matter of the technology catching up and being able to work down that priority chain. Okay, I think last question. I find kids are just not doing it. How do we make sure they are reading it over and over again? That's a very good point, Deborah. And I think when that happens, I think the best thing to do is to move away from the whole group and to start moving into small groups. I don't know what your classroom situation is. There are, of course, logistical challenges that as well too. But if maybe a small group of 2 or 3 kids can start interchanging and reading together, being responsible for a paragraph at a time, it certainly does require a little bit more attention. I hear your concern. I think there are ways of perhaps dividing, making smart decisions about how you create the groups within your classroom environment.
I see, Stephanie, you have a question about how would you get students ESL to verbally explain and analyze reasoning if language is limited? What a great question. I think particularly at the elementary level, there are a lot of opportunities to have students do drawings to explain their reasoning. If we're having them explain how did they add a certain thing or how did they multiply, in addition to explaining it with words, if they can make a drawing, it's a great way for them to get across the reasoning that they're using.
Okay. I think we are finished. Those are the only questions that are at this time. Again, Jack and I thank you very much for your time today. We enjoyed this, and we hope that you found some value in what we had to say as well too.